Hello and welcome to Libertarians Do It Voluntarily. We're going to have dropped frames again. So the video is going to periodically freeze, but the audio should be good. I am getting a different setup, so we'll be fixing this, but that's how it is for now. So every once in a while, it's just going to freeze. Um, the other thing is I'm struggling a little bit with speech this afternoon. Uh, I've had a lot of chemotherapy, and part of that is on occasion it just makes it really difficult for me um, to just like say what I want to say. So, but I think it should be relatively okay, and I'm just gonna keep going forward with it. But if I pause for a moment, it's probably just because I can see the word, I can freaking taste the word. I can't always say the word, but I'm going to go forward with it. So on Wednesdays, I'm doing what I'm calling news, but it's also olds because it's not necessarily things that are topical for that exact day. Some things will be and some things won't be. So the first thing is the Democratic primary. So what do I think of the Democratic primary? I think the same thing that I've thought all along, and that is it's Biden. It's Biden. It's been Biden since the front. It's going to be Biden at the finish. Um, these debates don't mean anything. They really don't. So after after the last presidential primary and all the issues that came up after that, and there were a lot of issues. Um, what happened after that was the Democrats appeared to do a revision of their primary process that would be a reform, but it really wasn't a reform. What they did was the super delegates are not going to vote on the first round. They can vote if a candidate does not get 51% or higher in the first round. So then they come in and they vote. So I've been watching with some amusement how the Democrats have had all of these debates and they keep bringing people in, right? They're keeping all of their candidates in and keeping them on this debate. Yeah, they're excluding some of them. Yang in particular, he's, oh my God, so screwed. It's not even funny. And so they're keeping them in because they're hedging their bet. What they want is if Biden isn't going to get it on the very first round, they want enough people still in the field that no one gets it in the first round, right? And then the super delegates can come in the second round of voting and they can pick who they want, which clearly has been Biden from the very beginning. I mean, that is so apparent, it's not even funny. So get ready for creepy Uncle Joe. Sorry, Democrats. That's what you're going to end up with. So now it's switching to the Libertarian primary. So the Libertarian doesn't actually, like, we don't actually have a real primary. What we have is we vote for our presidential and vice presidential nominee at the convention. And they're separate. So there's a separate vote for presidential nominee, separate vote for vice presidential nominee, and we keep those separate. So the presidential nominee, which is what everyone seems to be focusing on right now, and we have, geez, I think at last count it was almost 300 people that have contacted us, but really there's probably 10 or so that have fulfilled the requirements set by LP National, which the requirements are pretty low. So I mean it's a low bar that you have to hop over. Like a centipede could hop over that bar. Okay. Um, but those candidates are starting to go to the different state conventions. Don't get too hung up on any particular votes that are happening at state conventions. Yes, they're really great benchmarks. Yes, they're really great for kind of taking the temperature of that particular state, like where they're at. But this is not a binding primary. We don't have that. Our delegates are not bound. So delegates can come to our convention, which, is like the 20 something of May, and take everything in, actually talk to, both the VP and presidential nominees, and really get a feel for who they want to be elected. So don't get too hung up on that yet. It is good for our presidential candidates to go to the different state conventions and talk to our delegates and our potential delegates and have a real conversation about where they stand on issues and that kind of thing. That's spectacular. It's spectacular for our potential candidates to be bringing people into the Libertarian Party, to be getting news coverage, all that kind of stuff. I don't discount that at all. That's spectacular. Like I want to see more of that. But it's a long time between now and May. So if you do have a particular candidate that you are super excited about and you're really happy, champion that candidate. Okay, so now what we're going to get into as far as news is zoning. And the reason why I'm getting into zoning is this is something that we're looking at for my city. And many cities are starting to really re-examine their zoning. And I know zoning does not sound like the most interesting, exciting thing right now. But I think what most people don't realize is that zoning was brought into effect in this country basically to either restrict into a small area either Black people or immigrants, or they were looking at driving Black people and immigrants out of a specific area that they wanted to take that land. And that's the history of it. And that's the legacy that we have with zoning. Is that the case with zoning right now? Not necessarily. But we still have to examine what the basis is for zoning and what the history is for zoning and how that's affected people so that we can make good decisions at our local level and continue forward with that. So zoning was actually introduced in the early 1900s, like 1908ish, 1910, right in there. And Los Angeles was like the first city that was like, I am all in on zoning. And what they were looking at is they were looking at separating heavy industrial from residential, which makes total sense. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. Like, you understand that. But what they also did, and what other cities did, and and why zoning, just like built steam and just went all across the country. Just, I mean, so quick. It was probably like 2 decades and it was everywhere. Is what they were really looking to do is they were looking at separating what they considered slums, right? Which was really lower income housing or where recent immigrants were living, from single family housing, which was your higher class people. They could afford to buy a home that sat on its own piece of property. So they were looking at separating those two groups and not allowing one group to mix in with the other. This primarily happened in the North. So this was kind of that soft racism that you hear about. In the South, it was very explicit. And in fact, in the South, they tried to have racially explicit zoning, meaning, whites and blacks couldn't interact. And in fact, Richmond made it illegal for white people to sell their property to black people if it was a residential property. So, they weren't even coy about it. They just went flat out with it. So, thank you very much for watching and following. Thank you. So they were looking at setting this up, and they weren't even going to be coy about it, or they weren't going to be shy about it. They were just going to set it up. All right, if you're a white person, you cannot sell your property to black people because we don't want black people in this area. The Supreme Court then took that case up and said, you really can't be that explicit about it. Can you be a little more on the down low? And so cities were like, absolutely, I can do this and I can be on the down low about it. And so what they happened was, and I'll use Baltimore as an example because Baltimore is still struggling with this and struggling hard with this. So what Baltimore did was say, okay, we're not going to be explicit about that, but we're going to say what the use is. So we're going to go through usage on zoning. And so what they did was they said, okay, what we're going to do is when we see a residential area that we don't like and we would like to get rid of, we're going to change the zoning to industrial. And then we're going to have pretty toxic factories move into that area and take it over. And then that pushed out Black communities, it pushed out immigrant communities, that type of thing. So they would actually look for residential communities, like areas that already had residential areas in it. And they were thinking, yeah, you know what? Not our kind of people. We want to get them to move out. And so they would change the zoning to an industrial zoning. So how we think of zoning now is, zoning is to protect residential areas so that like a mercury factory can't move in, right? But how zoning was created is it was created so that you could change a residential zone and put that type of factory in and then push those communities out and push them further and further and further out. So that's what Baltimore did, and Baltimore is still really, really struggling with this, and struggling in so many ways I can't even describe it. The other way that they did it was a typical way that government does it, which is to call something one thing, but have it mean the exact opposite. So what they called it was housing betterment, right? And so what they would say is, okay, this housing that's here, that's not really good housing for people to be in. So we need to make rules to make it better for those people to live in there. What they were really doing is they were creating code enforcement rules that would be such a high barrier that those communities could no longer live there. And what ended up happening is then cities would use eminent domain to clear those areas out. And they would say, it's a blighted community, so we're going to completely take it over and clear it out. Magically, it never returned to residential. It ended up being sold to businesses and that type of thing. Funny that way, right? So they would take that land, and here's another term that you always have to look out for when you're looking at local government, which is higher and better use. Anytime you hear those terms, take a step back and take a closer look. Because what it really means is those people that are using that property in that way, I don't like it, and I want to take their property and I want to use it the way I want to use it, which usually means selling it to some type of business, and some type of business that also coincidentally is donating to people's re-election campaigns. So the Institute for Justice looked at, and this is not just something that happened decades ago, this is still happening. So in 2005, which is not that long ago, I mean, okay, I'm kind of old, so 2005 is pretty close, but whatever. So the Institute for Justice looked at 184 eminent domain cases. And they found that eminent domain was used like extremely disproportionately against minority property holders. In Fairfax County, Virginia, there was a study on code enforcement complaints, which goes hand in hand with zoning. And they looked specifically at a complaint of too many cars in the driveway. Okay, so this is people calling in residential areas, too many cars in the driveway. They're in the driveway. I mean, they own their driveway. They should be able to do whatever the hell they want, but whatever. Funny coincidence. Most of those driveways that were being complained about were either Asian or Hispanic owners. So that's another way that zoning, hand in hand with code enforcement and compliance, pushes out either immigrants or people who are not white. So single family zoning. So single family zoning gets divided into different areas. There's R1 usually, which is like your single family, and then you have R2, which is multifamily. You have R3, which is your trailer parks, mobile homes, that kind of thing. From the early 1900s, we had those divisions, and they were used to keep minorities and immigrants, people who were lower class, into an entirely different place. So now we have cities which are starting to look at cutting back on zoning. And they're looking at cutting back on zoning, and hand in hand with that, some of the regulation, because they want to make homes more affordable. So because of the regulation and because of zoning, depending on where you live, just to put a shovel in the ground to make a home is $40,000. That doesn't give any other costs whatsoever. That's just putting the shovel in the ground. So cities are now starting to look at how can we make housing more affordable without placing limits on the market. And one of the best ways is to remove all that R1, R3, R2, all that kind of stuff, and also cut back on the just crazy pants regulation that homeowners are subjected to and developers are subjected to. The interesting thing is a lot of people are scared of, oh my God, my property values are going to decrease. But what happens when you start to eliminate this zoning and you allow things like ADUs, you allow things like mixed use, all of these different things where you're starting to decrease that property zoning regulation, and also decrease the regulatory in that area, is property values increase. They don't decrease. It's the opposite. So when your city is looking at zoning, or your city is looking at regulatory practices for, building codes and all that kind of stuff, anything that is strictly outside of safety, take a real Scandus eye on that. and take a look at it and push for elimination of those things. And you can do so with the feeling, knowing that your property value is actually going to increase. So when you're living in an area where you have mixed use zoning, meaning you can have residential and you can have some commercial, um, you know, you can have a mix of zoning, that's going to bring your property value up. In our city, we're looking at increasing our mixed use zoning, and we're looking at even pushing that into our industrial areas. Does that mean that we're going to be putting industrial areas into residential? No, it doesn't. What it does mean is that our industrial areas can have office parks and residents and restaurants and homes and apartments and all kinds of things like that in it, because that's how people want to live now. That's what they're preferring to live at. Now, for people who still want to live in single family homes, that's fine. You still have that. But I do really recommend for more cities to push their business areas to be mixed rather than your commercial, your industrial, very segmented out. Go mixed. And for your residential areas, eliminate your R1, your R2, your R3, which is your single family, your multifamily, and your parks and that type of thing. Start to consolidate those. Take that step, because that step is going to make your communities way more exciting and livable, and it's going to increase your property values. It's going to allow you more options when you want to sell. So that's my little speech on zoning. So I know you were thinking zoning is totally boring and bullshit and all that kind of stuff, but zoning is zoning is one of those things that can't cannot detach itself from its racist and classist origins. It can't. So we do need to eliminate it, and we need to eliminate it not just because it's freaking evil, but because it also makes economic sense. So that's my deal on zoning and the primaries and all that kind of stuff. And I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining me. This was very exciting. I am getting a new computer, so I will not have this annoying lag probably by next week. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it.